I want to welcome everybody back to this afternoon's session. My name is Tanya Domi, and I am an adjunct professor affiliated with the Harriman Institute. I have taught on the region of the former Soviet Union, but indeed this is not my specialty, so I apologize in advance if I make any mistakes in pronunciation. I am a media expert and have worked in the region, not in Ukraine, but I have worked in Armenia and Georgia. I might add that I teach a human rights course at Harriman and have been hosting all year a speaker series on LGBT human rights emerging in the Balkans. Let me just say a couple of things about the media environment in the Ukraine. It's fraught with all kinds of challenges, lots of oppression. Impunity, I think, is a good character, a good word to describe how Ukrainian officials and the state has actively oppressed reporters, media houses, outlets, using tax police, straight out violence, criminalizing defamation, doing the reverse of progressive liberalism across the globe. Ukraine is going in the opposite direction. Of course, nothing really should or can be said about the fact that the former president has been let off the hook in terms of his own personal role in the execution of Mr. Georgy Gogadze, and I remember his murder in 2000. I had just left the Balkans at that time. It was absolutely shocking. The fact that the case is still being litigated is indeed evidence of impunity at work. I might add to, and would be remiss if I did not point out, that there's been a wave of anti-gay violence in the region. To wit, Olena Zhevchenko is just the latest evidence of that, of oppression. She was arrested and tried in December for organizing a protest without first notifying city authorities. I met Olena in December at the UN and did an interview of her at that time. I think she and all of her colleagues represent some of the bravest people right now attempting to assert their human rights and their ability to freedom and freedom of expression. I think that their example is a good one in terms of what is current on the ground, facing so many people throughout the former Soviet Union, and indeed also in the former Yugoslavia. The idea that people are outside somehow the Western norm, the fact that states like Ukraine and Russia and other states in the region pejoritize and call them EU values, the fact that they ignore rulings by the European Court of Human Rights with impunity, is a real testament to these people. They're very inspirational. I understand what it's like to fight outside what is conventionally acceptable, and for those who stand up and confront the state. This is now, in the 21st century, the new movement for human rights, which is being fought in Ukraine and in the region. So it is my pleasure to, and that is part of our discourse today, and I wanted to make a point on that. So this panel is Media Discourse, Ideology, and Discrimination. We're going to have a thorough examination here of the Ukrainian media and looking at the various representations of language, historical memory, ethnicity, race, and sexual orientation. I regret that I haven't been able to read the papers in advance, but I do look forward to hearing our colleagues speak and make their presentation. I want to introduce them very quickly. Niklas Bernsand is the coordinator for the Center for European Studies at Lund University and a PhD student in Eastern and Central European Studies. He's going to present a case study. Maksym Butkevych, who is from No Borders, an NGO, where he is currently the co-coordinator of the Social Action Center. You can read his bio. He's obviously very experienced in the field of media. He is going to give us a presentation on xenophobia, the phantom menace, and proactive other, how Ukrainian media tend to present migrants in the LGBT community. And I'm delighted that we are joined by Volodymyr Kulyk, who is with the National Academy of Sciences at Ukraine and Harvard University. He's going to discuss languages in the Ukrainian media regulations, markets, and ideology. Volodymyr is quite accomplished. He's the head research fellow at the Institute of Political and Ethnic Studies, National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and he's currently the Petro Yasik Distinguished Research Fellow at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. So without further ado, who would like to begin? Okay, Niklas. Okay, please take the floor.
Okay. So within this panel on the ideological dimensions of Ukrainian media discourse, I was invited to speak about how the Ukrainian media deals with issues of historical memory. So thank you for the invitation. I have earlier done some work on language and identity in Ukraine, mixed languages, and much of it based on mass media material. As for the coverage of historical memory in Ukrainian mass media, this is of course a huge and dynamic topic, and it confronts no less ideological diversity and complexity than you can find in other fields of Ukrainian memory discourse. So I will limit this discussion to news media and take my examples from newspapers, which is the genre I have mostly worked with. So I will try to give a quick view on the media memory discourses on the national level, firstly, which are the key memory topics and the most important explicit ideological positions that shape discursive space. I will then also try to provide most of my empirical examples from a case study I made on how a multicultural historical past is dealt with in local Ukrainian language newspapers in Chernivtsi, in Ukrainian Butkevych. So the aim here was to study how the media coverage of Chernivtsi's 600th anniversary in 2008 dealt with the multi-ethnic past of this former Austrian and Romanian city, and with the presently mostly absent ethnic groups that once took part in building the city, such as Jews, Germans, Poles, and so on. So this might illustrate how some general features of Ukrainian media discourse in memory plays out in a local field. But it also might offer insights into how media works with historical pasts that are at least partly different from the most usually studied battlefields of, say, partisan discourses, what I say, Ukrainian nationalist, ethno-nationalist versus Eastern Slavic or Neo-Soviet, Soviet one. Then I will conclude by shortly taking a quick look at the modes of remembering that can be identified in memory work in Ukrainian news media. So, news media, unlike other media genres like film, literature, music, is considered by several researchers to be understudied as sources for memory studies, and this is particularly so in post-Soviet memory studies. This might be surprising since media, as Volodymyr Kulyk argues, mediates the communication for the academic producers with the general population and does so for people of all ages. So, Idai argues that journalistic accounts of the past can have wide implications for collective memory and might affect how collective identities and societal cohesion are informed by reflections on the past. Especially this might be so when society is in a state of flux and is perceived to lack stability and common ground, and where there is no clear hegemonic view on a certain issue. Often there must be some kind of reason for the media to write about historical events. Rarely a publication is, or not so often a publication is triggered by the mere wish of an author to reflect on the past. So often media memory work starts somewhere else, in politics for example, with supporting or challenging dominant discourses, or by the publication of artistic academic books, the making of a film on a historical subject, and so on, which then can be remedialized and adjusted in various ways by news media. We have exceptions, of course, in specialized editions or additions to some newspaper or news sites like Historyczna Prawda at the Ukraińska Prawda websites, for example. One can find extensive articles on subjects that are not maybe so much discussed at the very moment elsewhere. So media is not a primary producer, but memories in news media are not only remediated from other domains, but they are shaped also by journalistic and editorial processes of selection and interpretation. And some actors might have their views heard more easily than others, obviously. So if media is not the primary producer of historical memory, memory discourse then it's no surprise that media is comprised of what is already out there in the society it approaches. So the archive of medialized memories is obviously huge, with all the diversity of memories ranging from personal memories of protagonists appearing in the media, collective memories of smaller scale social units, families, individual neighborhoods, local sports team, to memories that are connected to larger identity narratives about, well, wider social units pertaining to a region, a city, or an ethnic group, a nation, or an imagined supranational community like the Eastern Slavic one, for example, or the European one. As for the wider national narratives, medialized memory in Ukraine often boils down to larger themes and frameworks that are perceived to have the most salience in the country, and most importantly to disputed issues of the defining memory conflicts, so to speak. It is often said that on the national level, historical memory in Ukraine could be characterized as divisive and even polarized. So this reflects the diversity of socially, culturally, and politically salient ethnocultural and regional identities, and the historical memories that challenge or support them. So collective memory in any country, of course, is a constantly evolving occurrence. There might be a difference here between, say, a post-Soviet, post-colonial society such as the Ukrainian and some, say, more established nation states such as Sweden. So in Sweden, even when we have conflicting positions on some salient historical topics, there is a general agreement on which is the community that is viewed as the subject of this memory. So the polarization in Ukrainian memory debates to some extent might reflect the lack of such a subject. The main partisan narratives consist, as you know, and researchers might use different terms, of one narrative that could be described as, say, Ukrainian nationalist, anti-Soviet, and a competing one that is often called, say, East Slavic or Neo-Soviet, maybe. These narratives do not, of course, only involve historical memory, but are often tied to specific views on other controversial subjects, such as language. They are, of course, tied to competing political agendas, parties, organizations that support or exploit them for various purposes. So there are two overarching, highly symbolically charged, and in terms of content, very large ideological packages that are regularly played out in the Ukrainian news media. And then among the most sensitive and regularly featured topics, those narratives conflict about are the Volodymyr, the mass famine from the early 1930s, of course, Second World War, various topics there in latest years, most notably UPA. But there can be references to other symbolically charged themes that might be attributed to those larger narratives. Other conflicting historical memories organized into ethnocultural narratives are sometimes reflected in newspaper and electronic media on the national level. Sometimes Ukrainian Polish in Galicia, Volhynia, Crimea, with this intersecting Ukrainian, Russian, Tatar memories. Rarely in the national press you can see Ukrainian, Romanian memory topics. Then you have Ukrainian Jewish memories. Sometimes you can see toxic memories from World War II that partly are outside the framework of those competing discourses, but tend to be part of a larger international memory discourse. There might be other recurring themes that might have a different logics. For example, conflicts over historical preservation of a certain built urban heritage, for example, where the struggle often is portrayed as being between social movements and activists arguing for preservation and financial interests, with then various roles being awarded to civil servants. Recently we had the example of Andrievsky Uzvisink in Kiev in this regard. In Chernivtsi, there has been such discussions on the building of a new cinema on the place of the Jewish temple. So the relevant division here is not ethnocultural, but rather between various perspectives and priorities. In some cases, one could put it in the old 19th century Russian terms, such as kuptsi versus intelligenti, to some degree. As for Chernivtsi, I recently took part in a book project at our center in Lund about multicultural memories in Eastern and Central European cities that have gone through fundamental ethnodemographic changes in the 20th century, such as Chernivtsi, Lviv, Wrocław, Chisinau, etc. So how does the present majority population of such cities remember the old ethnocultural diversity from the time before population transfers, exodus, or genocide? So I then wrote a chapter on the coverage of multicultural memories about Chernivtsi's 600th anniversary in 2008 in 5 Ukrainian language newspapers. The newspapers include Молодий Буковинець, Bukovina, Chas, Duba, Chernivtsi. I can talk a bit more about that in the question times if someone is interested. There are a number of reasons why this research might be of interest to this panel. Firstly, it is a case study of memory work in local media, which is an even more understudied aspect of memory discourses in Ukraine. And secondly, this mythologized multi-ethnic and multilingual past of Chernivtsi and Bukovina makes it possible to study multicultural memory, and a topic partly outside the bipartisan discourses, so to speak. Thirdly, memory culture in Bukovina is more ambivalent and a bit more relaxed in comparison with memory culture in neighboring Galicia, or with, say, national conflicts between the partisan memory discourses. For example, as for the general setting, the urban toponymy in Chernivtsi has been only partially desovietized. Another narrative has rather been added to the urban symbolic landscape. For example, Ukrainian national liberation narrative, as well as street names and monuments devoted to the city's multi-ethnic heritage and the region's Austrian and Romanian past. So there is an ambivalence and coexistence and avoidance of conflicts between different narratives that makes this city closer to cities in central Ukraine, maybe, than to, for example, Lviv. So often the relations between the narratives are characterized not by continuity or reinterpretation, and not by a distinct break. They rather just share the same space. So they add narratives to already existing ones. So narrative diversity is recognized but not problematized. Conflict is rather avoided, and sometimes you can detect that the lack of conceptualization is deliberate. Could give you some example of that. And I can also see that this reoccurs in the media coverage of the corpus I studied. Fourthly, prosthetic memories shaped by stories in news media can be important for those who have no personal memories of the existing past. And the parents and grandparents of a great majority of city dwellers in Censorship did not live in the city in 1940. So there are not many people left with their own memory of pre-war times, and many people with potential post-memories do not live in the city anymore. So this is a case where medialized memory might be quite important. Fifthly, the media discourse provide insights into local ideas on cultural diversity, on specific tropes, say in local political, medial, and academic narratives and ethnic relations. This is frequently called the Bukovinska tolerantnost, the Bukovinian tolerance, which you can hear everywhere in the media, from a multitude of actors. So it points to the harmonious relations between a large number of ethnic and religious groups and remembers the Austrian times as a golden age for the city and tries to connect this to the notions about the city's Europeanness. So it's kind of conservative multiculturalism that does not include, say, gay rights or feminist positions. So it's a tolerance that recognizes diversity and celebrates diversity, but there is no real discourse on power rights, on power relations, for example. So one can ask then, if this anniversary did trigger memory discourses in local newspapers on the multi-ethnic past in the city. On the one hand, it did. There were quite a few historical representations of the Austrian period, for example, and of the ethnic groups that inhabited the city earlier. It was quotes from official speeches, a few lengthier essays, and in the actual reporting from the festivities. The old diversity is mentioned in connection with the opening of new monuments, presentation of books, German and Yiddish language writers, for example, stories about some visitors to the city, the architecture, for example, from Austrian times. On the other hand, with the exception of some printed speeches of politicians and a few more extensive stories, there were little reflection and little interpretation of what the past might mean for contemporary city dwellers. So there was no single article or news item that discussed the actual fate of the earlier inhabitants. So it is quite clear that local media did not operate in the mode of, say, raising consciousness or drawing moral lessons that, for example, you can find in Swedish media, always often quite clumsy. They rather sought out another form of usable past for Censorship. The multi-ethnic past was not ignored, but rather local mnemonic actors seems to regard the multi-ethnic past as an asset rather than a challenge. So it's an asset for city branding, it's an asset for commercial use, it's an asset for political use. And the relations between the present post-Soviet normalcy of the city and components of its older multi-ethnic parts are also seldom problematized. So the festivities showcased the present city's ethnic diversity by pointing to the open and tolerant cooperation of distinct, say, Ukrainian, Romanian, Polish, Jewish communities native to Bukovina, but the near exclusive exile status of, for example, Poles and Jews was alluded to it rather than being explained to the readers. So perhaps one might argue that a striking feature of how memory is operationalized in media discourse here is the absence of what sociologist and media and memory scholar Jeffrey Olick calls the politics of regret. This is, of course, an umbrella term for various practices such as public apologies, the work of truth commissions, reparation, and criminal prosecution that are united by a perceived need to confront toxic legacies of the past. So The politics of regret focuses on toxic issues like crimes against humanity, genocides, legacies of totalitarian regimes, persecution of minorities, and so on. So this is drawn upon also as a source of modern political legitimization, only one does not point to the good past, the gloriful past, but to the painful past and the troublesome memories. So it's a collective memories that is then disgusted by itself and put emphasis on learning the lessons of history rather than celebrating morally uplifting continuities. In Censorship, to achieve a usual past, it seems that one rather looks for positive continuities. One picks up the elements that can be used for community building and city branding today. This is perhaps what Connaughton called the type of forgetting that is constitutive for the shaping of a new identity. And you can also say that it builds on earlier Soviet elements to some extent. This does not mean that memory discourse in Ukrainian news media in general is dominated by glorious and heroic versions of the past. There's at least as much focus on suffering. And there is more of a focus on one's own suffering rather than on the wrongs one might have done to others. So on the national level, a common mode in explicit emotionally charged partisan discourses is that someone else should be regretful. The opposite camp, it can be zapadienцы, коммуняки, whatever, but they should regret themselves. Now the point here is not that everyone should readily embrace a Hegelian mission to reach the final stage of historical consciousness or something like that. I mean, the merits of politics of regret are not straightforward but debatable, and, for example, in terms of community cohesion. There are also many ways in a country like Sweden where you can point to the existence of this large mode of remembering, like politics of regret. There are thousands of ways for politicians and leading actors to escape responsibility. So this is not a normative argument, it's rather a way of pointing to a specific feature of memory discourses here and which perhaps can be discussed later. Thank you.